Researchers from the University of Washington estimate that between 2003 and 2011, nearly 500,000 people died because of the war in Iraq. The study found that for every 3 people killed by violence during the invasion, 2 more died as a result of the collapse of the infrastructure that supports health care, clean water, nutrition, and transportation. I speak with Raed Jarrar, who's an expert on political issues related to U.S. engagement in the Arab world.
I met Raed in our offices in Washington, D.C. He's currently the director of Advocacy at the nonprofit Democracy for the Arab World Now.
Well, Raed, let's start with what it was like being in Iraq, growing up there. Kind of give us an idea of how things shifted in a way that you had to actually leave the country.
I try to go back in time to think how it felt to be in Iraq in the 1980s and 1990s. And knowing what I knew then, it just felt like life. It was a country, like I did not have many other points of reference to compare it to. Although my family lived in other countries before. We lived in Jordan, in Saudi Arabia, in other countries in the region. And for me, it just felt like another country with some variations. I didn't really understand the political context very much. But of course, as a kid, I could feel the consequences of politics. Like, for example, in my school in Baghdad, during the 1990s, because of the sanctions, we started losing power at school. The school building was falling apart. Windows were broken. The desks were not working. So you could feel the deterioration of the infrastructure as a result of the 1990s sanctions that were imposed in Iraq.
But you say wars and bombings and violence as though that's like grocery shopping and paying your utility bills. I mean, it's such a different frame of reference for people in the West. So talk to me about that kind of how it's, and perhaps the frustration of sitting there as you are, somebody who's lived through it, and seeing it from the Western prism versus your prism of reality.
Yeah, I mean, the contrast is very starking. Like when I got to leave Iraq, live in other countries and go back for visits, of course I could see the contrast more. Like I remember going back for a visit in the early 2000s, and we're sitting outside with my family, and there is a wedding happening close by, like people are preparing for a wedding. And in the middle of that, there's an air raid, and bombs fall on Baghdad, and sirens go off. And everyone, like, very slowly moves out of the way. They wait until the bombs start falling. And they come back and the music goes on. And I'm thinking, this is very unusual. Like, people's reactions to bombs falling are very unusual compared to anyone who's not living in a war zone. But yeah, I mean, that is why. Because unlike the mainstream narrative that we have in the U.S., that the Iraq war started in 2003, from an Iraqi perspective, the war really started in 1991. The first Gulf War was the beginning of military hostilities between the US and Iraq, and that never stopped. So in 1991, there was a war. There were almost monthly bombings and bombardments and attacks all throughout the 90s. And then the sanctions were in the background, destroying the country slowly. And then in 2003, that was kind of like the season finale for the war. So it wasn't seen as a new war. It wasn't seen as a beginning of a war, but rather a beginning of a new chapter of an ongoing war.
Raed is a graduate of the University of Baghdad and the University of Jordan, where he received his master's in architectural engineering. His master's thesis focused on post-war reconstruction.
Weren't there times, though, where you must have thought, am I going to make it through today? I mean, if bombs are falling that close, and how does that change how you interact with people? I mean, if you fear that perhaps mom and dad may be gone tomorrow, or I may be gone tomorrow, how does that change you as a person?
Death becomes a part of your daily reality. in the US or other countries, not very prone to wars. I think we don't really see that part. Like in the US, we see glimpses of extreme violence with mass shootings, and it is very shocking because it goes from someone walking in a mall, and then there is this extreme violence introduced in a bubble, and people see it. It's death and blood, and it's shocking to see it. And that, but imagine that mass shooting being a mass shooting affecting your entire country all the time. Like that is the situation. So everyone is like the relationship between the death and the living is very, very different. It's very stressful to be there. And I have, like many other people who lived in Iraq, encountered many days when I thought to myself, I am going to die right now. I remember very vividly this one moment in 2003 during the so-called shock and awe. I was with my family in Baghdad, and we created a safe room. That's what we called it. It's not safe. It's like one of our bedrooms. We taped the windows and put all of the, it's like farther away from the street. Put some supplies and water in the room. But our house was very close to the airport in Baghdad, and there was very severe bombing going on in the airport. And at one moment, one of the bombs fell so close by that the house, I thought it's going to fall. I remember dust coming out of the walls. Like that's the visual memory that I remember. Like the walls had dust coming out of them. The doors were pushed out of the frames. All of the windows shattered. And we all looked at each other in this moment. And I thought that's the last moment that we're going to see each other. Like it is this moment where you face death. But then it passes and everyone is like, oh, okay, we're alive. And then you move on with your life. And I think many Iraqis went through, the lucky ones went through these kind of moments. The lesser lucky ones actually died.
But then how do you sleep at night? I mean, those nagging memories haunting you.
There are those who stay in Iraq and their mental health status, and there are those who leave the country and their mental health status. And I've read a lot about this, like the post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. It's actually better to stay in the country. There is, for your mental health, it's easier if you go with a group of people through the rise of conflict and the demise of conflict together as a group and process it together. It's much better for your mental health than what happens to someone like me or a US soldier who is shipped into a space of conflict and goes from 0 to 100. And then after a few months, you're shipped out from 100 to 0. And then that contrast, it shocks you. Like I remember when I left Iraq in 2004 to Jordan, I had this moment where I was standing in the mall in Amman. Amman is it looks like anywhere America. These like big malls, 30 different kinds of cereals for breakfast. Mm. And I remember standing there trying to choose my cereal and feeling very like frozen, like this. I couldn't cope with the normalcy in Jordan. And when I came to the US, there was a documentary about US soldiers with PTSD who come back to the US, many of whom commit suicide because of the pain of what they have done or seen in Iraq. They come back, it's very hard to handle. And there is a scene in the documentary of a US soldier standing in a CVS aisle in front of the cereal and he froze, like trying to pick which one. And it's so funny. It's like a very random, I don't think anyone else would pick on that, but for me it was this very relatable moment, like the moment of the mental health crisis that gets to people who live in places like Baghdad or Gaza or other cities that are dealing with conflict on a daily basis, and how it gets, it's very painful, very dangerous, but like work with it within a community versus those who are parachuted in and out of conflict. It's a bad situation for both, I have to say, but very different.
In In 2003, U.S. Ambassador Paul Bremer was named leader of the Coalition Provisional Authority in Iraq by the U.S. government. In this role, he created a new structure of government in Iraq.
Violent crime in Baghdad has dropped 39% in the last 2 months. As you can see, it didn't succeed.
I interviewed Paul Bremer, who still believes that was a great move. I think anybody who looks at it objectively would say it was a disaster. But give me your sense of how that kind of fueled what we saw in Iraq.
It was a disaster, and anyone who doesn't admit it was a disaster is just not telling the truth. I doubt if Paul Bremer or anyone else actually believed it was a good move. Maybe they have to say it was a good move because of politics surrounding it. But, the Iraq War was a disaster, a major disaster. Every decision that was made was a disaster. Going to war was a disaster. Occupying Iraq was a disaster. Dismantling the Iraqi army was a disaster. And the de-Baathification or the exclusion of all members of the Ba'ath Party was also a disaster. And that was a part of a bigger recipe that led to the complete chaos and destruction of Iraq. The recipe required dismantlement of the state and state institutions. And those state institutions were not political, really. Iraq was it's like a big, socialized country. So the public sector was run by the government, and the government ran everything: education, health, car manufacturing, everything was government. So those ministries, Ministry of Industry, of Ministry of Health, those ones were not created by the Ba'ath Party or by Saddam Hussein. They were inherited from the government before. Like Iraq had these very proud institutions for self-governance that were created from the 1920s, from the early days of the First Kingdom. So the dismantlement of these institutions led to the chaos and death and destruction of millions of Iraqis. And I think the idea of de-Baathification that you just mentioned, just imagine it. It's a chaos in a country. There is the political system has collapsed. And Paul Bremer decides to exclude any member of the Ba'ath Party from being a part of the new Iraq, the new reality. Where would they go? Where would they go? Like by excluding them, we're giving them that little dark corner to go hide and organize and come back and mess up whatever new Iraq it is. That is the only outcome.
On May 1st, 2003, U.S. President George W. Bush gave a televised speech announcing major combat operations in Iraq had ended.
Major combat operations in Iraq have ended. In the Battle of Iraq, the United States and our allies have prevailed.
Raed, today, what are your hopes for Iraq?
That's a difficult question, honestly. It's difficult to think about hopes after all of these years of pain and suffering. And I think my number one hope has been that the killing and the destruction and death would stop. Like that, no more damage. That's the number one hope. Like back in the day, I think our hopes were so grand, we wanted to create a beautiful country, do this and that. I think now the number one hope is stopping more damage. And that part, the U.S. can help with it a lot, because the U.S. is a part of the problem. The U.S. is causing lots of damage by its military intervention or by supporting political parties that are causing more death and destruction in Iraq. So I think that's like the number one step, is do no more damage. I think after that, giving some space for Iraqis to rebuild their country is the next step. So like a process of reconciliation and reconstruction. And the good news in Iraq, unlike many other countries in the region, is that Iraq is a very rich country. So it has, hundreds of billions of dollars worth of oil being pumped every year. And that could end up helping rebuild the country.
One more quick question. I know that you pretty much stated that the foreign policy approach of the United States is broken. What would you like the American citizenry to do to put more pressure on the government to kind of respond in a more appropriate fashion in the future?
No, when I moved out of Iraq in 2004, 2005, I landed in San Francisco in California. And my first job there was a canvasser, knocking on doors to ask U.S. citizens to do something about the Iraq war. So I did that for a living for a while. And my main question at the time, in 2004 or 2005, was, would you write to a member of Congress to ask them to stop interfering in Iraq? Because I think for me that was an important step. It's not the final step. It's not that if the U.S. stops interfering in Iraq, Iraq would become heaven on earth the next day. But it was an important prerequisite, the first step. So, I mean, ironically, that's what I would say now. On the 20th anniversary of the Iraq War, I would say what we have to ask our government here to be is to stop interfering in Iraq. Stop interfering. Like, we have to stop interfering. We have to stop taking sides in the political parties in the country. Stop sending troops. Stop sending weapons to Iraqi factions. I think that is the first important step to allow for more space for Iraqis to work on their country.
On October 21st, 2011, U.S. President Barack Obama announced that the remaining 39,000 U.S. troops would return from Iraq by the end of 2011, marking a conclusion to the nearly 9-year war in Iraq.
Today, I can report that, as promised, the rest of our troops in Iraq will come home by the end of the year. After nearly 9 years, America's war in Iraq will be over.
Let me ask one final question, which is, how things are sold here in the West. We're going to go over, we're going to, free these people. We're going to give them democracy. You frame it much differently, which is things work right now. They're coming over. They're going to give us chaos, which is basically what ended up happening. What needs to happen? Because clearly Iraq is not an isolated episode when it comes to U.S. foreign policy. I mean, we could look to Afghanistan, which many would agree is also a failed enterprise. And the list is probably much longer than that. What should be the lessons learned by the U.S. government when it comes to foreign policy and how to approach it?
Unfortunately, we have not learned any lessons from the Iraq war in this town. We repeat the exact same justifications and suggestions and assumptions that led to the disaster in Iraq whenever we are dealing with other situations in other countries. So it's 2023 now, and the narrative about what happened in Iraq is very skewed. Sometimes I read, like on the 20th anniversary of the war this year, I read a few analyses in mainstream media. I think to myself, like, they're talking about a different country. Like, I was there. That's not what happened at all. Like, it's a revisionist history to maintain the status quo. Our foreign policy machine that has the same kind of assumptions of us being the policeman of the world, the good guy who's going to go there and, help people and fight the bad guys. The same very simplistic, in many cases childish narrative given to the U.S. public to justify this big war machine and spending exists to date. And unfortunately, we see it repeating itself in in other countries, whether it's in the Middle East or outside of the Middle East, some of the narrative also you could capture, bits and pieces of it in Europe with Ukraine and the United States' responsibility to do something there. Like there are some repetitions of the same kind of analysis there. So the answer to your question is nothing. This town has not learned anything from the Iraq War. We don't have any major breakthroughs that says we made a big mistake, and that is the mistake, and we're not going to repeat it again. That does not happen at all. It's either rewriting the history of facts that happened, or trying to sweep it under the rug. So unfortunately, I have to say that 20 years after the invasion of 2003, we haven't really moved that far from the reasons why that invasion happened. And although we have new members of Congress who are more, educated about international issues, they bring a different kind of messaging to try to sway foreign policy, whether it's in Iraq or Israel, Palestine, or other places. Things are moving slowly in a different direction. But when it comes to the bigger mainstream administration decisions, engagement with the rest of the world, I don't think there has been any lessons learned.
We're going to have to leave it there. Raed, thanks so much for your analysis, your perspective, and a great conversation. Stay away from the cereal aisle.